Messina in Sicily was where the common market began in 1955. It was a moment in history that Britain missed. 40 years later, there were celebrations to mark that original conference, and Britain almost missed those too. The British Foreign Secretary, Douglas Hurd, was last to arrive, and late. And when it was time for a show of European unity on the steps of the town hall, Britain was last to arrive and late again. Just what the others seemed to expect.
We made a mistake 40 years ago. We corrected that mistake, but by the time we entered the European community, it had already formed several policies in a way which doesn't suit us particularly well. So we have to learn from that. And that's what the Prime Minister meant being at the heart of Europe.
Time and again, that's been the story of Britain's adventures in Europe. Never quite on time, never quite catching the spirit of things. While the party was in full swing, Douglas Hurd found he had more pressing business. For Britain, it wasn't a party at all, more a memorial to bungled policies and buried ambitions. Whatever their view of the issue, European unity has been a poisoned chalice for 2 generations of British politicians. In its time, Europe has split both main political parties and been a graveyard of political reputations.
With the exception of Edward Heath, no British Prime Minister has not suffered from Europe rather than the reverse. They've all come back from the deadly swamps of Europe with some sort of fever.
The native swamp dwellers of Europe confuse the British. For 50 years, we have both patronized them and been scared by them.
We certainly regard ourselves in many respects as superior to the others. But at the same time, we have this sort of feeling that somehow or other they're going to be cleverer than we are. That we may be honest, but we're not very clever.
Since politicians are confused by Europe, they have in turn confused the public. 5 decades have been marked by wishful thinking, illusion and betrayal. It's scarcely surprising that the voters are suspicious of the whole business.
They're not saying we don't like it because we don't like it. They're saying much more, but this is not what we were sold. We were sold something quite different. And if we'd been sold the true bill of goods that we now perceive, we might very well not have liked it. What we dislike most of all is that we've been fibbed to.
There was a time not so long ago when Britain welcomed the idea of European Union. In June 1940, London was bracing itself for the fall of France to the Nazis. General Charles de Gaulle came to London to put an astonishing rescue plan to Winston Churchill. Britain and France should unite as a single nation.
When he arrived, he was taken straight into the cabinet. And of course, we were all agog to know what was all about. And we were afterwards informed that he had come over with a proposal that there should be a union between France and Britain with common citizenship.
The scheme had been dreamt up by Jean Monnet, a civil servant who would later become the father of the European community.
The government of the United Kingdom and the French Republic make this declaration of indissoluble union. Every citizen of France will enjoy immediately citizenship of Great Britain. Every British subject will become a citizen of France.
Monnet's draft was agreed in a hurry by Churchill and the War Cabinet, with one prophetic proviso. They couldn't stomach his proposal for a single currency. In any case, it all came to naught. The French cabinet turned down Monnet's plan a few hours later. As soon as the war was over, Churchill took up the cause of European unity again.
20,000 people packed the Dam, or centre of Amsterdam, to give a welcome to Winston Churchill. And the new song, Europe Unite, was sung as he drove past on his way through the city.
His vision of a United States of Europe inspired those nations trying to rebuild their continent.
We cannot aim at anything less than the union of Europe as a whole, and we look forward with confidence to the day when that union will be achieved.
He had rather a simplest view of it. I always liken him to Moses, who pointed the way to the promised land, but he never actually led the children of Israel into it, because he was old. But he did point the way and fired the zeal and enthusiasm of others.
Please lift your two fingers once more for the free sign, the sign of victory, but now the sign of winning the peace.
But Churchill left one thing ambiguous. Was he saying Britain should become a partner in the new Europe, or just its sponsor? European doublespeak had begun. Britain did become a founder member of the Council of Europe, which was set up in Strasbourg in 1949. It had no real power, but it seemed like the first sign of a new order.
Here there is something that may change the course of our lives. Here, history is being made. This is Strasbourg, France, the home of the Council of Europe.
Messieurs et mesdames, prenez garde. Je vais parler français.
Away from the crowds, Churchill astounded members of the new council. Germany, he said, the old enemy, must be part of the club.
He looked round rather like a bull, an old bull fighting. And he said, I don't see any Germans. You know, you can't make Europe without Germany. There was no applause anywhere, a deep disillusion. Here was their hero praising the Germans. And it was as if he'd broken wind in public.
But after 3 wars with Germany in 80 years, France too saw the sense of reaching out to the old enemy. In 1950, the French Foreign Minister, Robert Schuman, proposed that the raw material of war, coal and steel, be taken out of the hands of individual countries and controlled by a shared authority.
Schuman is speaking. Correspondents know that this is a front-page story.
Look, Schumann's just started to speak. Oh Lord, off we go.
Le Conseil de l'Europe, en effet. France's Foreign Minister, Robert Schuman, is the author of the bold, imaginative plan which bears his name. It is the key to the future of Europe, economic as well as political.
The Schuman plan would only work if France and Germany, the old enemies, were locked in a lover's embrace.
So kann die Lösung nur lauten. Handeln wir,
let us act rapidly, because tomorrow it might be too late.
Britain could have joined the lovebirds, but Britain had won the war. It still had its empire and a special relationship with America. Did it really need to get mixed up with the wrecked shells of Europe? The day the plan was announced, Jean Monnet had flown to London.
Oh, he said, I've got it here. And he took out of his pocket a piece of paper and gave it to us to read. And this was the essence of the Schuman plan. And it said a condition of joining would be that we would accept the principle of a federal Europe. We said, we don't think that the government will be able to accept this. Are we to understand that if we don't agree to this, you don't want us in? And he said, yes, that is the position.
On top of that, the British Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, was miffed. He suspected that Dean Acheson, the American Secretary of State, was in cahoots with the French. Bevin was right. The Americans had indeed been consulted first.
He was particularly upset that Dean Acheson, with whom he was working very closely, had not informed him in advance, although he knew about it and had very strongly encouraged it.
There was suspicion in Bevin's mind, deep suspicion when we first arrived. But by the time he heard it over and over again that we had not known anything about it until we had arrived in Paris, he became convinced. And the British did not throw cold water on it. Neither did they wax enthusiasm for it either.
For 3 weeks, the Labour government sat on the fence. Then the French gave them 24 hours to make up their mind.
I was just preparing to go home from the Treasury at 8 o'clock, and my secretary told me that a message had been received from the French that unless we had agreed to accept the whole thing by 8 o'clock the following evening, we should be excluded from all further discussions.
It was almost an ultimatum, so to speak. We want to reply by such and such a date. And, you know, I used to learn Latin years and years ago, and I was told that you could write letters in which you put the position in a way which required the answer yes or no. This was very definitely the kind of thing that expected and required the answer no.
Well, I said to my private secretary, I can't believe such a message has been sent by the French government, which up to that moment we assumed were a friendly and civilized government. And he said, well, that's just what all the ministers have said, so we're wiring back to Paris.
That didn't help. Paris confirmed the deadline. But it happened to be the Whitsun holiday week, and Attlee, the Prime Minister, was away. Bevin, by now a sick man, was in hospital, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer was ill too. But a decision was needed.
A cabinet meeting was held, rather at 2:11. There were two possible courses. One was to send a protest to this uncivilized diplomatic behavior, and the other was to ignore it.
We gave what is essentially a negative reply. And the reply was somewhat delayed, partly on account of the ministerial situation, and partly because it was a very serious matter.
World interest focuses on the Quai d'Orsay, as 6 European nations, including Western Germany, meet for their first working session on the Schuman Plan for pooling steel and coal. But Britain, notable absentee, has not yet made up her mind. Her absence begs the question, can the Schuman Plan possibly succeed?
The answer was yes. Sure, the Europeans wanted Britain in, but they weren't going to hang around forever.
Monet made it clear to us. He said, we must have Britain. You can't build Europe without Britain, but you will not get the British unless you first create facts. Britain, he always used to say, will never act on a hypothesis. It will only act on facts.
We had so many other interests worldwide. So I think it's not surprising that we didn't go barging in. And I'm rather surprised that we've gone in as far as we have.
Soon, the European coal and steel community was up and running without the British. They'd missed the first step, and they were about to miss the second. Three years later, on the coast of Sicily, the grand design of Europe took more elaborate shape. Messina now boasts of being the birthplace of the European Union. But back in 1955, it was a faraway place of which the British knew little. In June that year, the 6 foreign ministers of the coal and steel community held a critical meeting. Avoiding war by controlling raw materials was one thing. Now they dreamt of linking their economies together in a common market. Britain thought it was pie in the sky.
People didn't really believe that Europe was going to be a going concern. I remember it so well. Because Europe had made a hash of things so often.
They very nearly made a hash of this one. The delegations were staying in the nearby town of Taormina in a former monastery. Even without Britain, there were problems. The French were worried about a loss of sovereignty if the Six moved any closer together. Their foreign minister, Antoine Pinet, was unhappy. Efforts to win him round were led by his Belgian counterpart, Paul-Henri Spaak. But as the conference drew to a close with a special ballet performance in the ancient Greek theatre, there was still no agreement.
C'était merveilleux. Mais j'avoue que M. Spaak était un peu impatient parce qu'il pensait beaucoup plus à la conférence qu'à la danse qu'il voyait. Spaak se précipite chez Pinet, il est vers 11 h du soir. Il m'a dit plus tard qu'il était resté pendant 1 heure, 1 heure et demie chez Pinet.
They could not stay on for another day, so they had to come to a decision. And either they were to agree on something or it would have been a failure.
Eventually, Pinet accepted Spaak's compromise. He'd take part in planning how a common market would operate, but decide later whether or not to join. It may have sounded like the first Euro fudge, but Spaak knew he was home and dry.
À 4 h du matin, Spaak sort souriant de la conférence et il me dit « Venez avec moi et commandez une bouteille de champagne ». Nous montons à la chambre de M. Spaak. Le soleil se levait sur la mer Ionienne, il faisait magnifique. Et à ce moment-là, on apporte la bouteille de champagne, Spaak la brandit en l'air et il se met à chanter au Sole Mio parce que c'est le lever du soleil.
Spaak started singing Sole Mio. Not very well because he had not a very good voice. And a window opened above us and we heard the men shouting in France.
Écoutez Spaak, vous m'avez embêté toute la nuit, pour l'amour du ciel, laissez-moi dormir.
Can't you, scum of the earth, get to bed and leave the people sleeping? And we looked, it was Monsieur Pinet, so we all scampered away and went to bed.
Nobody at that time actually was aware how important that step was. It was seen as a procedural progress at the best. With hindsight, we now know that that step was decisive.
Did you feel at any stage you should have had the British there?
No.
Did you ever think of having the British there?
No.
The story is that the government had said that Messina was too outlandish a place to send a British civil servant to. Whether that's true or not, I can't tell you. But that was certainly the feeling in those days, that Britain was outside.
Even then, it was not too late. The talks moved on to fine detail in Brussels, and Spaak, as chairman, invited Britain to attend. But Anthony Eden's government was in two minds about Spaak's invitation. Should it send someone to keep an eye on what the outlandish Europeans were up to, or stay well clear? The Foreign Office in those days was heavily Eurosceptic and scorned any continental entanglements.
There was this yearning for British leadership. Every time they dreamed up something, in the famous words of Mrs. Thatcher, we said no, 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 and we wouldn't have anything to do with it. And this was one of the reasons why I begged Anthony Eden to allow me or some other Foreign Office minister, or any minister, to go to those early discussions.
But Eden said no. Instead, he sent a hapless fall guy to the talks, Russell Bretherton, a middle-ranking civil servant from the Board of Trade. The Foreign Office couldn't even decide what to call him. Delegate, too chummy. Observer, too standoffish. How about representative? Ah, that'd do. And his job? Easy. Don't agree to anything.
I remember him, he was sucking a pipe most of the time, and looking at us like he was a teacher of a naughty class of children.
His contributions to discussions were mainly giving the impression, in any case, that he was trying to sow doubt about what we were doing. Asking questions as, you do not really believe that a customs union would be possible among countries like you, and you do not really believe that it would ever be possible to create a common agricultural market. I mean, that sort of contributions.
But Bretherton was no fool. He knew the Six were serious, and he told London so. Harold Macmillan, Eden's Foreign Secretary, registered a languid flicker of interest. "This is our second string," he once wrote. "We may need it. The one-world approach isn't going with the swing at the moment. It may even bankrupt us." Nonetheless, 2 months later, Bretherton left.
He bowed out on instructions from London, of course, saying that London thought that they knew now enough about what the validity was of the proposal, that they had come to the conclusion that it would never work, and that therefore there was no sense in him wasting any more time and energy.
We didn't bother about it because he had not been playing a very active role, and we thought maybe he'd come back tomorrow, but he didn't come back and we never saw him again.
The Six pressed ahead and naturally reached agreements to suit themselves rather than Britain. The European Economic Community was born in January 1957 with a treaty signed on the site of the ancient Roman capital.
The moment of emotion was the day we signed the treaty in Rome. Spark turned to us and he said, "There is what's left of the Roman Empire. Do you think that we have built today, putting the first stone of a new Roman Empire, and this time without firing a shot?" And we all felt that way, yes, that we all belong to the same culture, the same civilization. We felt very strongly to be Romans that day.
Britain wasn't among them, and one young German was so dismayed at Britain's absence that he could not bring himself to vote to ratify the treaty.
Britain was not in it, and I thought this was a major mistake. I was a convinced European, but if Britain was not a member, I thought it would go wrong, and therefore I did abstain.
From that moment, Britain forfeited the chance of leading the post-war Europe.
We came out of the war with the fact, although to some extent an illusion, of being a victor state. Psychologically, we were never in the same position as France, because their future lay in rebuilding Europe, in the French case, leading Europe.
For thousands of years, frontiers have dominated the life of continental Europe, and at the frontier, most things come to a stop. And now, this age-old system is being checked.
As soon as the common market began to take effect, the British attitude changed too, from lofty disdain to aggressive competition.
And above all, what does it mean for us?
Macmillan saw the fledgling market as a threat and set up a free trade area which other countries in Europe could belong to.
Macmillan was completely hostile. He said, "You're going to ruin our trade. This is the end of our trade. We cannot accept that, and I'm going to fight you."
But Downing Street had lost its taste for battle. The aftermath of Suez and the fundamental weakness of the economy forced Macmillan to plan a stealthy U-turn.
The change itself came enormously suddenly. The ground had been shifting below, but the buildings had not shifted on top. And suddenly in June 1960, Macmillan circulated to cabinet colleagues a note asking for their department's views about the advantages and the disadvantages of joining the community. And I think to most people in Whitehall this struck like a thunderbolt.
Proof came the next month. Macmillan's cabinet reshuffle turned post-war Foreign Office policy on its head. Pro-Europeans were moved into key ministries. Duncan Sandys would soothe ruffled feathers in the Commonwealth. Christopher Soames would ease the farmers into the Common Agricultural Policy. And at the Foreign Office itself, a new young number 2 was given the job of negotiating Britain's entry, Edward Heath. The message had finally sunk in. The world was changing. It had all been predicted 3 years earlier by the British ambassador in Paris. In a confidential note, he'd said, "We may be able to torpedo the common market, but if we can't, we'll be forced to associate with it eventually on less advantageous terms." That rueful prediction was now coming true.
There's always been a desire to find an empire somewhere else. And the imperialist wing of the Conservative Party as well as the protectionist wing was attracted by the prospects of a European economic community. Here was something big to join. Here was something protective.
More to the point, here was 15 months of hard grind in Brussels, the mind-numbing, rump-hardening marathon which would later become all too familiar. Heath had to sort out tariffs on every Commonwealth product, from kangaroo tail soup to cricket bats. For the fastidious, it wasn't much fun.
We couldn't open the windows because the traffic and the trams made too much of a noise outside. The atmosphere inside the room, the physical atmosphere, was quite appalling. You have to remember that in those days, probably 50, 60, 70% of the people attending the conference smoked like chimneys. And of those, probably 1/3 smoked cigars. And the impact of that on the human frame was at times nearly intolerable.
In Brussels, Mr. Heath has fashioned for himself a political stature he's never quite achieved before. People ask if he might not be the next Prime Minister but one.
Heath even enjoyed the routine and kept other ministers on a tight leash.
I was there the whole time. Any other minister who was invited in hadn't been there, and obviously couldn't know when he came what the atmosphere was like, what things had to be avoided, what things could be pressed. And therefore, in order to avoid any difficulties arising from that, it was much better I should keep the whole thing under control.
I remember saying to him, look, you are the, and I use the German word, Kapellmeister, you are the director of this orchestra. This was an image which I hope would appeal to him. And why not sort of use your position in that way? And tomorrow it'll be the Commonwealth Secretary who will have a little solo, and the day after it'll be the Agriculture Minister who will have a little solo. You are still there at the, on the podium with the score in front of you, and you are directing. Well, he sort of said, yes, 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 you may be right, yes, yes, you may be right. But I don't think he changed very much after that.
These were some of the most significant talks since 1945, but they sometimes sounded like an episode of The Archers.
The whole future balance of power is being discussed here in terms of the relative number of eggs laid by hens in Denmark and France.
There was always friction with the Ministry of Agriculture. Ted explained in political terms that the moment of truth had come, that the nonsense had got to stop, that big concessions had now got to be made. And he then said, now what are they? And he began extracting these concessions out of Christopher Soames, personally, one by one.
While they wrangled in private over food, in public the common market became another elixir of the 60s.
In the common market, the barriers are gradually coming down. The barriers to trade, the barriers to the free movement across frontiers of goods.
Macmillan clearly hoped that success in the negotiations would burnish his reputation, another triumph for Supermac.
At the speed she's going, the European community will be rid of all artificial barriers to trade by 1970.
It was not said that the community had no political content, but it was argued, and argued very strongly, that it was a primarily economic community. Now, actually, that is not true. I think that some of the people who said that knew it was not true.
Indeed, it was now heavy-duty politics at home.
This program is going to be about Britain and Europe. It's one of the great issues of the day, and rightly so, for much depends upon it.
Why have we entered into these negotiations with the European Economic Community? There are powerful political and economic reasons why we have done so.
Not everyone in Britain was persuaded. Rank-and-file members of the Labour Party were hostile, though most acolytes of the leader, Hugh Gaitskell, were in favour. That group was dismayed by his speech at the 1962 party conference.
For we are not just a part of Europe, at least not yet. We have a different history, We have ties and links which run across the whole world. If this is the idea, the end of Britain as an independent nation state, I make no apology for repeating it, the end of 1,000 years of history. You may say, all right, let it end. But my goodness, it's a decision that needs a little care and thought.
There were a group who were bitterly disappointed, could hardly contain their grief and rage. They simply couldn't scarcely believe it that their Hugh had turned against people who had been his closest aides, allies, intellectual collaborators.
To find that our hero was actually saying that the common market represented the end of 1,000 years of British history, that our borders were not on the Rhine, they were on the Himalayas, and so forth, was a terrible shock. I mean, it was actually a kind of personal agony.
I'd had a very long lunch with him in the Garrick Club about 2 to 3 weeks beforehand, in which we tried to reach common ground. And we got on till about 4:30. Everybody else had gone. He was pacing up and down the small back room there. But the more we talked, the further apart we got. So in that sense, it wasn't a shock to me, except that as he made various points of 1,000 years of history, I thought, oh Christ, it's even worse than I thought.
With Labour split, Supermax saw his chance. He was convinced that if he himself intervened, he could persuade the French to let Britain in. In December 1962, he arrived at Rambouillet outside Paris for a private conference designed to smooth the way for Heath's negotiators in Brussels. But General de Gaulle, a wartime supplicant at Britain's door, was now President of France and able to call the shots.
Au début, l'atmosphère était excellente. C'est à la fin, n'est-ce pas, que M. Macmillan a abordé la question de l'entrée de la Grande-Bretagne en Europe comme si c'était une question quasiment réglée déjà et qu'il suffisait d'un petit coup de pouce, n'est-ce pas, pour aboutir.
De Gaulle a expliqué à Macmillan que quelle que fût l'amitié qui existait entre la Grande-Bretagne et la France, il n'était pas possible, pour le moment, à la Grande-Bretagne d'entrer dans le marché commun. C'est de là qu'est venu le fait que ces conversations se sont terminées sur un désaccord complet.
Il a certainement été profondément déçu, et je dirais même profondément blessé. Cette réunion s'est terminée dans une atmosphère très mélancolique.
Eh bien, voyons, Milord.
Macmillan had failed, and he knew it.
Mieux que ça.
De Gaulle informed the French cabinet in words which his information minister noted in his diary.
Ce ne sont pas des affaires de sentiments, ce sont des affaires de réalité et de chiffres. Il a conclu d'une façon plaisante en rappelant une chanson d'Edith Piaf et voyant que Macmillan était un peu triste devant ce que lui disait le général de Gaulle, celui-ci ne pouvait que lui chanter la chanson d'Edith Piaf, « Ne pleurez pas, Milord ».
Mais vous pleurez, Milord, ça je l'aurais jamais cru.
For Macmillan himself, this was the beginning of the end. 3 months later came the Profumo scandal, and by the following autumn he would be out of office.
Un petit effort.
The official description of the meeting was, of course, couched in diplomatic niceties that purported to leave the door open. But the British ambassador reported that Macmillan was in tears as he made his way home. One of de Gaulle's complaints was Britain's relationship with America. A few days later, President Kennedy arrived in Nassau in the Bahamas and offered Macmillan the Polaris missile. This was the pretext de Gaulle needed, proof that Britain was in America's pocket. But it was just a pretext. De Gaulle had already set his plans in motion.
Il m'a annoncé qu'il ferait une conférence de presse à la mi-janvier et il m'a dit « Je vais vider, vous voyez ce que je veux dire, vider la question de l'entrée de l'Angleterre dans le marché commun.
Je vais expliquer pourquoi elle ne peut pas y entrer dans le moment où nous sommes, parce qu'elle a des liens avec le Commonwealth et qu'elle a des liens avec les États-Unis qui ne le permettent pas pour le moment. Et cela se situait avant la conférence de Nassau.
It's clear from government documents that British diplomats in Paris, like Macmillan himself, were in no doubt that the common market talks were doomed. But still, it was kept from the negotiators in Brussels.
We were not aware of storm clouds gathering at all. We did not conclude from Rambouillet and Nassau that de Gaulle now was going to ensure we did not become members of the community. We did not appreciate that.
No disaster, Rambouillet. It passed off okay. That's the message that we read. Well, we read it wrong.
Our feeling was, as we went away for the Christmas break, that another heave when we came back, and we'd be there.
The road to Brussels, the road that Edward Heath, Britain's chief common market negotiator, will take again next week. On Monday begins the crisis stage of Britain's negotiations with the common market. But the most powerful of European political leaders, General de Gaulle, is clearly doubtful whether Britain ought to come in at all. Edward Heath is in Paris seeing the French foreign minister.
In the British embassy, rumours were flying around about what de Gaulle was going to say at his press conference. Heath decided to check things out for himself. He invited de Gaulle's foreign minister, Maurice Couve de Merville, to an intimate lunch in the tapestried dining room.
C'était un homme naturellement intelligent et capable. Il avait beaucoup de qualités. Je ne crois pas exagérer en disant que nous avions établi entre nous, Heath et moi, de véritables relations d'amitié.
The three surviving diners, Heath, Couve, and the deputy head of the Brussels delegation, Sir Eric Rolle, disagree on what then took place.
But we had this lunch, which was very agreeable. We talked about a lot of things. And then the question was put to Couve, specifically, is the general going to say no on Monday? And Couve denied that. Couve said, I have no reason to think that that is so. And indeed, he said, if we can resolve the remaining technical problems, no power on earth can stop you from coming in. Well, that was a pretty straightforward reply.
His attitude was that it would all be settled.
Were you worried that there might be a veto?
No, not for a moment.
Did you ask him specifically about that?
No. What he said was it was going to be a success. And when he says that, you don't ask him whether he's going to veto it.
Do you remember the precise words he used?
Yes, what he said was no power on earth can now prevent this from being a success.
Do you remember using that particular phrase, if these things can be sorted out, no power on earth could prevent you coming in?
Oui, oui, en effet. Si la Grande-Bretagne était prête à tout accepter, il n'y avait pas de possibilité de lui refuser l'entrée dans le marché commun. C'est vrai. Je n'ai jamais dit à Heath que la Grande-Bretagne pouvait entrer tout de suite, parce que je ne le pensais pas. Et il y avait encore trop de problèmes à régler.
No, he meant nothing of the sort, and he said that many, many years later, when he was an old man. And whether deliberately or not, he was changing his reply.
It was the Battle of Waterloo all over again. Only this time, the other lot won. De Gaulle finally took the stage on the 14th of January, in words loaded with that Gallic superiority which so infuriates the British. He electrified the 800 journalists present and horrified officials in Brussels.
Pour définir explicitement la position de la France face à l'entrée de l'Angleterre dans le marché commun et l'évolution politique de l'Europe.
Bien, je ne suis pas étonné que vous me le demandiez. L'Angleterre, en effet, elle, est insulaire. Elle est maritime.
The mood in the delegation was fury. Fury at the arrogance of the man.
La nature la structure, la conjoncture qui sont propres à l'Angleterre diffèrent profondément de celles des continentaux.
My reaction was, this is going to be front page news in every newspaper in the world.
Alors il est possible qu'un jour, l'Angleterre parvienne à se transformer elle-même suffisamment pour faire partie de la communauté européenne sans restriction, sans réserve et de préférence à quoi que ce soit.
Je n'en ai pas été surpris. J'ai constaté que ça faisait un effet épouvantable sur mes partenaires, pas seulement sur les Britanniques, mais sur mes partenaires.
Et c'est bien là ce qui paraît résulter des longues conversations de Bruxelles.
We looked at each other and it was like thunder had stricken the room. We were all flabbergasted.
Ce sera un grand honneur pour le Premier ministre britannique, pour mon ami M. Harold Macmillan et pour son gouvernement, d'avoir fait faire les premiers pas à leur pays dans la voie qui un jour peut-être le conduira à s'amarrer au continent.
Each phrase was a new nail in the coffin of the negotiations, and I think only by the end of it did we all realize that this was in fact tantamount to a veto.
At home, Macmillan's silent agony finally boiled over. In Liverpool, he used in public the same words he'd used in private to de Gaulle at Rambouillet.
If there was an objection in principle, we should surely have been told so from the start.
It was a body blow to the Macmillan come up before the next election thesis. He hadn't been given the magic counter that he was looking for. It had been struck from his hand.
In Brussels, the dogged Heath and his team refused to give up. For a fortnight, they carried on as if de Gaulle's press conference had been a bad dream. Anyway, there was always Germany to help out. Chancellor Adenauer was due in Paris to sign a friendship treaty. Maybe he could talk de Gaulle round.
Adenauer accepted that he would try it. To what extent he was tried to be really persuasive with de Gaulle may be open to question.
With Adenauer's authority, it was decided to go and to sign the treaty, and then afterwards to do our best to work for the British entry, maybe a little bit later.
It was clear where the Germans' priorities lay. Adenauer was 87, and nothing was going to jeopardize the crowning moment of his career. Certainly not the British.
It was a great shock. It was being hand in glove with the enemy at the moment when the fell deed was being done. We had probably put too much hope on the Germans pulling our chestnuts out of the fire, I think.
The British had hoped that we would get the chestnuts for them out of the fire. Certainly that hope was an illusion. And we would have never sacrificed, I think, no German government, and in the first place, of course, Adenauer not, the cooperation and reconciliation with France.
France finally pulled the plug on the 29th of January 1963. Couve arrived in Brussels, formal veto in hand.
A staggering blow is dealt to Western unity in this council hall in Brussels when France blackballs Britain from the common market.
Couve laid the blame entirely on the British, that we refused to accept community disciplines here and there and so on. You asked about my own reaction. I had thought when we went in there that Couve de Murville was going to have a very embarrassing, difficult passage explaining the inexplicable. But in fact, I felt exceedingly angry as time went by. I thought that what he was saying was so outrageous, any sympathy I might have had for him quickly evaporated.
Mes partenaires étaient très mécontents, naturellement, de
de ma position et il me faisait des reproches incessamment.
Edward Heath, then unbelievably calm, took up Couve's points one by one. He didn't say, this is an outrageous travesty and so on, in judicial fashion, really, the learned QC type approach. He destroyed all these arguments, pointing out that we had agreed to this, we had agreed to that, we had agreed to that. Completely demolished Couve's argument.
But it did no good. Heath and his team, who'd for so long refused to accept the inevitable, now had to face the bitter truth.
The British delegation got up to go, and all the 5 ministers, not Couve, but the representatives of the other member states, all lined up to congratulate. At least I say that, and it's a slip of the tongue, but it's an interesting slip of the tongue, because it was a very warm farewell.
These hard-nosed, very experienced old hands, I was surprised to see so many of them visibly moved, and moved to the point of tears.
I can still see Couve de Murville and Olivier Wurmser still in their seats, the far end of the table on the right, back to the window, sort of laughing with each other. In retrospect, I think they must have found it acutely embarrassing.
The British did not take de Gaulle's veto lying down. They cancelled a visit to Paris by Princess Margaret. But to this day, Heath will not admit the negotiations failed.
In no sense was it a failure. We had achieved very remarkable results. And the fact that de Gaulle vetoed it was in no respect our fault.
We tend to forget our failures. We forget our humiliations. In a sense, it was a humiliation. So it's wiped from the public memory. Nevertheless, to my mind, it was the moment, that day in January 1963, when Britain turned towards Europe. The United Kingdom had made its decision for Europe from that moment on. Whatever the frustrations, there could be no going back.
Do you accept it was a betrayal by the French?
Oui, c'était une sorte de trahison. Oui, c'est vrai.
Thank God we're Englishmen and not common market scum. For why should we be pally with the wogs who started Calais? Oh, de Gaulle may be 10 feet tall and think he's Napoleon, but the French wash every 3 days on B-Day.
The Heron folk are a standing joke with their shorts and hairy knees.
And the poor old Dutch do nothing much but smell very faintly of cheese. An Italian beau always says hello with a squeeze of finger and thumb.
Thank you.
So, thank God we're Englishmen and not common market, not common market, not common market scum.